Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of The Nostalgia Trap. My name is David Parsons, and even though I was born in the late 1970s, I have a weird feeling of remembering the 1960s. Perhaps that's because I talk to a lot of people like my guest today, people who lived through the era and have vibrant stories to tell about what happened to them. My guest today is Barbara Garson. She's known for a lot of things. One thing that she may be most remembered for is writing a play called MacBird that was a controversial satire of the Johnson administration and the Kennedy family in the late 1960s. But she has a wide career in history on the left and being a radical activist and writer. And she's got incredible stories to tell, including being at the free speech movement in Berkeley, what her attitudes were towards the growing New Left, and everything that has occurred in American politics and economics in the years since. She's wrestling with capitalism and what it means on the ground for Americans in a way that I think is really unique, and I think her voice is really strong and profound. So it's great to talk to her. She's got a really strong personality, and she certainly has a ton of energy and a ton of things to say. I always enjoy talking to Barbara. I first made contact with Barbara when I was researching the GI coffeehouse movement, which some of you may know about, some of you may not. GI coffeehouses were coffeehouses set up for GIs, or American soldiers, during the Vietnam War outside American military bases. And they were meant to be places where GIs could come hang out off base and freely talk about things like the Vietnam War. They were a project of the larger anti-war movement, and Barbara tells me a little bit about her involvement in it. And she's got just an incredible take on what's happened in this country in the last 50 or 60 years. Her latest book is called Down the Up Escalator, How the 99% Live. And I have links to all her work on the blog at nostalgiatrap.libsyn.com. You can find more episodes on iTunes, like the Nostalgia Trap Facebook page, and you'll get updates on new episodes and all sorts of other stuff. You can also find the Nostalgia Trap on Stitcher.com, which allows you to download an app and put all sorts of podcasts on there to listen to in the car or wherever you listen to it. So thanks so much for listening, and I hope you enjoy this conversation with me and Barbara Garson.
I grew up in Brooklyn, and I went to Brooklyn College, and I didn't leave Brooklyn until my husband was expelled from college. Well, I was married very young at 16.
Oh, wow.
It was a mistake. Mm-hmm. And so we went out to California because the University of California, if you were a resident, and because we were married, we were residents within 6 months.
Oh, wow.
If you were a resident, the University of California was free.
Huh.
Free, although it did cost us about $125 a term in fees. Mm-hmm. Of course, we went at that historic time where we got involved in the free speech movement.
Yeah, and that, I definitely want to hear a little bit about that, because I just showed my students, I show it to almost every group of students I have, at least when I'm teaching U.S. history surveys of the 20th century, the movie Berkeley in the 60s.
Oh, yes.
That tells that story.
If you stand very tippy-toes, you might be able to see me in one of those crowds.
I mentioned that today, actually. I said
there was recently a movie called Berkeley, at Berkeley,
yeah,
on public television. You can see me there sitting at a table, a core table.
So how did that come about?
How did it come about?
Meaning, like, how did you get involved in that?
How did I get involved
in the free speech movement?
Excuse me, but I think there were about 28,000 people on campus, and I think there were probably over 10,000 people who did something more than come to rallies. I mean, the campus was involved.
Right. Because there's that moment where he's in the Jack Weinberg who's in the police car. Yeah, and it seems like that would when I think about college campuses, it seems like that would draw the attention of everybody, whether they were politically sympathetic or not. Everybody's going to come over.
Jack and I have to tell you that the police car was not as spontaneous as it seems. Sitting down around. Excuse me, we didn't know about the police car, but we were. It's so you don't want to hear all these parts of the free speech movement.
No, we don't need to go through everything.
There was a certain point,
in your involvement.
There was my involvement. I was the editor of the Free Speech Movement newsletter, which was just a 4-piece thing, but we raised the standards there. It was one of the first things ever done on a photo offset. All our daily leaflets were mimeographed. but we offset this one to get off to the different campuses to keep a lot of people informed about what was going on.
It seems like information and like being able to, the ability to print a newspaper was something that was obviously a lot more difficult technologically than and so important.
Well, we got an old press going that is still there. David Goines uses it for his artwork. And it became the Berkeley Free Press after the free speech movement. And the Berkeley Free Press went on for years doing both commercial work and movement work. But everybody understood that the movement work comes first.
Right.
And that and you have to wait if you're the commercial.
Did you when you went to Berkeley originally, did you
And so I think that having been part of something that was a total victory was the beginning of a very, different life for me than people who were involved in some of the SDS or other sectarian and unpleasant things that happened later. I mean, I won, and everybody was completely comradely because remember, no one knew what it was to be a student leader. There was no competition to be it, to be the voice that was heard. If anything, there was one person who really did have an unusual voice. I don't believe in the cult of the personality, but Mario did have a special quality. Because remember...
You're talking about Mario Savio.
Yes. He stuttered. When a person stutters, and then when he gets up to address the crowd, he loses that stutter. That's, that's like Moses.
That's something special.
That's something very special. And his...
There's a recent biography about him that talks a lot about this stuff.
It's a good biography. And it's called Freedom's Orator.
Yes, and it's a lot about speech and his stutter.
And he had that stutter, and so he really reached to people. And unlike later events where people were competing for press coverage, Mario would run away from the press. I mean, he had very long legs, and you could see him literally running across the campus away. Because we didn't believe in the cult of the personality.
Right.
And I remember that I wrote MacBird, sold after all. I always said over 500,000 copies. It turned out to be more than that because I recently met the salesman for the second press that handled it, and he mentioned that he sold 400,000 copies, and I said, well, Barney Ross had only paid me for 300. He said, well, that was Barney. Yeah,
MacBird is a well-known part of that 60s culture.
Right.
I want to get
I'm digressing because, I mean, what I'm saying is that we were in a spirit of real solidarity and comradeship, and you didn't feel even the most pushy intellectual student leader types. No one felt neglected. You had a discussion, and there were 5 things you could do. You could sit in or in the sit-in, and all those points were represented. And 10,000 people were standing around ready to try to vote on that. And the people that were thrust into the position of leadership were trying to shed the position of leadership.
Right, because they didn't believe in that model.
Now, I'm not sure that we passed a good lesson to people. I don't think Occupy did itself any favors or did us any favors by following our model and claiming to have no leaders and have no votes and have nobody that anybody,
Were you there
we made a mistake. Of course I was there at Occupy.
With the twinkle fingers thing?
Yes, and I enjoyed it, but I realized that I was old and I wasn't going to assert my point of view, and I was letting the same thing happen again. That is to say, the Berkeley free speech movement literally voted to dissolve itself. Because we didn't want to become a brake on the masses. Things were happening around us. We said, we don't know what position to take on this. Maybe we should dissolve ourselves. And boy, was that a mistake. I mean, that is to say, you look back at the 60s, and a lot of the music lasted, of course.
Right.
But we left no institutions. Not a student movement, not a daily newspaper, not a weekly newspaper, nothing that you could turn to when Bush was invading Iraq and know what the position was and what we should do and where we should meet that day.
Well, it's really interesting about the Occupy
thing. We left nothing, and that's the same with Occupy, because they were rightly, afraid of being co-opted. Well, yes, but You
Let
know,
me ask
you gotta take that risk.
Do you
You gotta.
think what Occupy was the end of that '60s thing, the
No,
last time, or was
no,
it the beginning of something?
It was a do-over.
Yeah.
They don't. I don't know
Because
how
it looked
much.
like the '60s visually in a lot of
Yes,
ways when you went down there.
You betcha.
I mean,
It was embarrassing.
and you say it's
It was
embarrassing.
embarrassing to look the same because it was then retro.
Yeah.
We weren't retro. They were retro.
Yeah, I understand
That part
yeah.
was a little embarrassing.
As someone who studied
and
the
then
60s, it was interesting to go down there and be able to see, this is what it looked
yes,
like.
and it didn't feel as good.
Yeah.
It didn't feel as good because people were poor and because it wasn't like a single campus where
about the
we all
police?
stayed
Has
together.
the police presence changed?
Of course, when we were at Berkeley, well, first of all, the Berkeley police were not the people that brought the that
The state
did the
violence.
rough stuff.
Yeah.
And when we were in Berkeley in the 60s, now remember the FSM spread out over a whole year of
64, 65.
Yes, of the university promising to listen to us, and then the Board of Regents being so rigid that they wouldn't even allow a committee to talk to them. And so then they would calm down, and then they would expel any names they had. They would expel their names over the Christmas holidays, thinking we were so short-memoried students that when they came back, they wouldn't matter. And it did matter. But the town was unified. I'm not saying everybody felt the same way, but you could go almost anywhere on the main streets and say, is there a meeting tonight?
Yeah.
Is the strike on or is the strike off? And it didn't matter whether it was a student or an older person
Everybody
or
knew.
a policeman.
Yeah.
And that, of course, was a function of the size of the town and of the good spirit of the event. So...
Can I ask you, when you came to Berkeley, were you already in a political mind?
Yes.
You were already
yes,
kind of...
yes, I had been to Cuba. I was wary of, I wasn't a old-fashioned communist, and I was wary of many things I saw there, but I also saw there that ordinary people could be changed overnight. Little villages could become organized to start doing things. I was worried about possible clampdowns on those doing things. I don't know where I stand now on their clampdowns because it turned out they needed to fight the United States. They needed to be organized in certain ways that might. I don't know how I feel about that. It's a very hard position.
On the early
how
days
to fight
of Cuba, it seems like there's a lot of excitement among the American left about Cuba.
Oh God, it was beatific, and they faced the same problems we faced, which is to say, how organized do you want to be in face of other people who do not share your spirit that this is so wonderful?
Right.
People who are willing to smash you. It's a problem that anarchists always have and have never solved. Certainly, Occupy didn't solve it.
No. Did you worry about anti-communism? Because it seems like that was the tone of things in the 50s and early 60s especially was incredibly anti-communist. And was that something
we didn't worry about it from that point of view? Oh, they're going to put us on a list and we'll be in trouble.
Right.
We were a little more sophisticated, and we didn't want to repeat communist history. I mean, we were free spirits. So, for instance, we always. Like Bettina Apteker was a real communist. Poor Bettina, she had to go at night after all of us got finished with our meetings. She'd have to go to a Communist Party meeting and explain to them that, look, it's not what things are different. It's a little different.
Yeah.
We were afraid of Communist Party lines and things like that, but we weren't afraid of being called communists. No. No, certainly not.
It
just was the flowering of the end of those 50s.
Yeah,
I walked
and
into it.
The kind of defiance of the
when
fear.
I would go to a professor and ask him to sign. When we had clubs on campus, and a club had to have an advisor, and an advisor had to sign for every guest you invited. And I would go and sign for guests, and I realized the professors were worried. And I had such a little sense of history that I didn't realize that only 4 or 5 years earlier, they would be thrown out and they were made to sign non-communist declarations. And I had no idea, you know what I mean? I just jumped into it, and nothing suggested to me that there was anything to worry about in what I was doing.
That's interesting, because it's like the
just on the cusp.
The younger people who were the ones that were defying the fear and saying, like,
not defying the fear. I didn't understand the fear. I didn't know what the fear was. I wasn't brought up in a communist family. I wasn't brought up on the left, and I didn't know what. I just didn't understand it.
Yeah.
I was born
free. If you weren't raised,
I was never a brave person.
If you weren't raised,
I always did things that were easy for me. The only thing that's hard for me is writing.
Yeah.
But everything else, I was never brave. Other people may say that. People say, do you realize what you said to me at such and such a time? And you said it right in class. I never was a brave person. I never realized.
So you said you were in the left you were not raised in a left family particularly, but where did you find it? Where did you find the left?
Well, for one thing, you remember, there was Cuba. I mean, just this like romantic left. At that point, remember, it was just the guys in berets. And then there had been Operation Abolition at Berkeley. That's why there was, not thousands, but that's why there were perhaps a few hundred people inclined in that direction at Berkeley at the same time.
That it was actually the federal government, ironically.
There had been a demonstration against HUAC in San Francisco, and the films of it all showed kids from Berkeley doing that. So that maybe brought that brought people there who were ready for that. But remember that was me. But when I look at the pictures of us in the 60s, we're going to have the 50th Free Speech Movement anniversary.
Oh, that would be this fall. That's right.
That's right. And we're going to have it on the day, as you say, of the police car, the sit-in around the police car that was trying to arrest and move students.
Are you going to Berkeley for that?
Yes,
That's
yes,
fantastic.
I am.
I wish I could be there.
I hope other FSMers will come. I mean, well, I think they will. I have to say that I am disappointed in my fellow alums because they say, right now, this is really heartbreaking. They say, let's invite the students who are fighting the same kind of battles we're fighting, and let's set up panels for them.
Yeah.
And they look for students who are fighting imperialism in Latin America, who are fighting immigrant battles, which are student battles. But I can't seem to make them understand that the students' own situation right now, student loans, that will not be able to be paid back by jobs. The students are oppressed now. We went to school free, and the students' own problem is the American problem now.
I think that's a really important point, Barbara, and I think it's basically what the free speech movement was about, was kind of a class of students realizing that they were looking at the civil rights movement, they were looking at, helping others.
That's
but then
right.
realizing that, we were an oppressed class.
No, that was not true. At that time, we were looking to help others, and the way in which Mario Savio tied our emotions in with the others was, I want an education that will allow me to do something better than learn how to grow a square tomato. Remember, we were an agricultural school, and we had an agricultural lab on the campus, and there were people learning how to grow the square tomatoes that you now all eat that don't have to be carefully harvested.
Right.
And so we said, why do we help the farm? Why are we going to grow up to help the agribusiness make square tomatoes? Why are we forbidden to stand outside campus and collect money for the farm workers who are organizing?
Yeah.
So we said, yes, it's about us, but we said it's about us wanting to do something significant with our lives. But what we did not say, so we tied our desire to do something in with the cause of the other people, the civil rights movement, and right. But what we did not say is what students now have a right to say. We are paying the full cost of college.
Yes.
A class of investors will have a lien on our income forever, not for 10 years. 10 years if you get to be a big lawyer and pay your student loan back. But if you pay it week by week, you will. A class of people. When I went to school was paid for out of taxes.
Yeah.
I told you I paid $125 in fees a term at Berkeley.
It makes me sick.
The state put a lot of money in. They were proud of having that agricultural institution. That's primarily what the state did.
I think that idea that you just mentioned, that, and I want to mention, the word you use is that investors will have a lien on the American people's income forever, is a profoundly disturbing and important point.
It is very, very disturbing.
Yeah.
And they don't even care if the economy is growing. Okay, they're saying, in fact, they've given up on the economy. They're saying, it's not going to grow, so let's get a bigger piece of the smaller pie.
Right.
They're going to work. We'll take 10%, 20% back on the income.
Right.
On their interest from forever.
Forever.
Essentially forever. If you have, like you told me you had.
Yes.
Such big. I don't know if you want me to say it.
No, I'd rather not share it right away.
Right. Yeah. That's why it's hard to organize students.
But
they don't want to share how much. They each feel personally.
It's a big part of our lives.
They each feel personally. I made a mistake. I shouldn't have taken this loan. I should have taken that loan. I shouldn't have taken the private loan. I should have taken the federal loan. The fact is that there has been a tax rebellion. Investors and the financial class,
corporations
have refused to pay taxes.
Yeah.
So therefore, schools that used to be run primarily out of federal monies, federal monies that were put in the form of, I have to say, Cold War monies. I never thought about it then, but it was essentially space race money.
Yes.
But that went into every part of the college, and it made, and then plus the contribution of the state, made my tuition free. Now tuitions are, even at that school, that free state school for in-state people is $12,000.
UC Berkeley?
Yes, it's $12,000.
Yeah, it's tremendous.
And it's more than double that when they tell you what if you want to live in school, and picking up side jobs isn't as easy as when we went
Not
there.
at all.
So all of it is very expensive.
And those side jobs don't pay enough to address what the debt you're accruing.
It's certainly not teaching costs that have made things go up, because the teachers are all migrant workers.
Yeah.
The teachers are all adjuncts who go from school to school.
That's what I am.
Hoping that they can. I mean, it's really a burden if you've learned French medieval literature.
Yes.
I mean, you've learned it, and you can only go from here to there to there to teach it. Okay. But in fact, you want to know something? Over 40 years ago, when In These Times first came out, they asked me to write an article, and I wrote an article that seemed very outrageous then. It was called Teaching as Scabbing, or Scabbing as Teaching, because I had been asked to teach playwriting at a college, and they were going to pay me what now would be still good for an adjunct, $3,000.
Yeah.
And I said, but I'll get $3,000, and another professor will get $3,000, a third will get $3,000, and that's like a full job we're doing for $9,000. I said as a joke, of course they're calling it an honorarium because it's an odd field, playwriting. Yeah. And they want a real playwright to do it. Right. Good, that's right. That's how it should be.
Yes.
I said, but before you turn around, they'll be doing English 101 as an adjunct.
Yes.
As an honorarium.
And you were right.
I thought it was, they said that was like a joke.
60 to 70% of courses at CUNY are taught by adjuncts. And they're saying in Ohio, which is such a state that's been pro-education for so long, about 80% of classes in Ohio at certain schools, state schools, public schools, being taught by adjuncts, making less than $20,000 a year.
Now these people are collecting huge debts to go to college.
Yes.
But so are people who are at nonprofit schools. I mean, at profit schools.
At for-profit schools.
Where their degree will not even allow them to be an adjunct teaching. They'll be minimum wage workers.
That's right. Well, let's go back to Berkeley.
But I want to say that this is all because of a tax refusal.
Yeah.
And the people who have refused to pay taxes have the lien on your future salary.
More than tax refusal, they've hijacked the political system and made the government the agent of that.
Yes, of course.
So can we go back to Berkeley, because I want to know how you got from being at the free speech movement to writing MacBird and that becoming this kind of moment, because it seems like that was a big moment.
I started writing MacBird for a teach-in at Berkeley. I did not finish it in time, or rather, I finished parts of it, but the group that was supposed to put it on didn't get it on.
An anti-war teach-in, or
yes, it was an anti-war teach-in. Although remember that MacBird was a play remembered famously for being anti-Johnson.
Yes,
because MacBird is Johnson and his other, but it was really saying to the students of my era. It made Johnson and Kennedy the same. Mm-hmm. But Kennedy would speak in these beautiful words about ask not what you can do for your country and
Yes.
And it was really just complete world domination view he had. And,
yes.
and I quoted his own speeches with just the slightest changes and put them in iambic pentameter, and you could see what they really were. And Johnson was crude. And in some ways, I sympathized more with Johnson because Johnson was, had that Richard III point of view.
Yes.
These beautiful people, why do the Kennedys look so good? And I was showing my scar in public, look so bad, when I'm doing so much more. And he was doing so much more for civil rights and poverty. And so my Johnson, the play is remembered as Answer Johnson, and many people say it's what drove Johnson from his third term. And it certainly showed the war as something he was ensconced in and big ego couldn't get out of.
Yeah.
But what I was really saying to my friends at the time was, hey, we have done so much. Let's not now jump on the Kennedy bandwagon, whether it be John Kennedy or Robert Kennedy. Let's not go into the Democratic Party. Let's build something independent. Let's build something, whether it be electoral or something else.
Did you find that the fact that Kennedy was assassinated led to a lot of people being very sympathetic to his memory and being resistant to you to kind of parodying his vision in that way?
Of course.
Yeah.
No, because the play was written. Yes, of course. Yeah. I mean, people. It was a big play and it sold a lot of copies, but it was shocking. Apparently, again, as I said, I never did anything brave or outrageous that I was aware of. But it turned out, for instance, that the New York Times wouldn't even take an ad, one of those ABC ads. The New Yorker wouldn't take an. I'm talking about taking an ad. I'm not talking about giving me a good review.
Yeah.
And so,
how did it come about as a Broadway play? Because
it wasn't Broadway; it was off-Broadway.
Either way,
that's a big difference. I didn't make money.
How did it come to be a play in New York? Because it's something you wrote as a student at Berkeley.
Yes.
Okay.
I came to New York with the manuscript typed, 6 copies on carbon paper.
That's great.
And the only person I knew in theater. Was in my high school. And he really wasn't in theater, as it turned out. I mean, he really wasn't where he might have been.
Yeah.
But he went to my high school, and his girlfriend was a secretary, part-time, a temp, at Random House, and she showed it to her bosses, and the word started getting around, and then it got reviewed in the New York Review of Books by Dwight McDonald, very favorably. I remember I was able to put an ad in.
Yeah.
To buy the copy with a little cheap ad, and I got over 10,000 responses just from that ad of people. We were selling it ourselves.
Yeah, I think I've read that review. It's a very positive review.
Yes.
He calls it like a really brilliant.
It was brilliant. Satire. It was so funny. I mean, I'm telling you what it's about, but if you watch it, you don't see anybody lecturing you this way.
How can you watch it now? I mean, people should see this again.
I don't know. There's a record. Every once in a while, somebody puts it on Halloween or something. You can always. I don't know if you can buy a copy, actually. It's out of
There's
print.
a record that came out of it.
Yeah.
A recording
remember who the cast was. Stacy Keach, Bill DeVane, Cleavon Little. All of these people working off-Broadway because they were not famous then.
Yeah.
And so that's how that happened. Remember, it wasn't Broadway. And remember, I too believed it was against the cult of the personality. At the height of my fame from MacBird, I went to work in a GI coffee house near an army base, in a small army base town, because that put me out of, in the heart of the movement, working with anti-war GIs.
Yes.
But out of the celebrity and the New York and all that, I don't know whether it's good or bad that I did that. Yes, I would love to be able to have the contacts. I still write plays, and my plays are better than my books. And I would love to be able to have people to show them to, although I'm not sure.
You think of yourself primarily as a playwright? Or
no,
just a writer?
I'm better at it. Yeah. I'm better at it. I'm more excited by a play idea. Yeah. Plays are harder to write.
Yes.
But I'm not a person of the theater, that life of the theater. I can't even stay up late. I can't even
Well, it seems like you perceived something that was, because this, like the San Francisco mime troupe, and there was, in Berkeley, there was like
then?
kind of like
there
was like a kind of
so
theater aspect to what was happening in the
because
60s.
theater is for talking to each other.
Yeah,
MacBird, I told you, I wrote it for a teaching. It's for talking to an audience you know.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, a lot of other people came, and they never picked up on the element of Kennedy being the same as Johnson.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I would go sometimes to productions.
People don't like to hear those kinds
I
of
went
things.
to the production outside of in Los Angeles.
Uh-huh.
And I stood there with my Peace and Freedom Party petition. You had to get a party on the ballot. You had to sign to be in that party, and if you were in that party, you couldn't be registered Democrat.
So you're tying the play directly to political action in the sense
Right.
that you're like standing
I'm
outside
standing
the theater.
outside the
You've
theater.
seen the play. Now
The
sign
people
up to
have
the Peace
come
and Freedom
out.
Party.
They have been laughing at Bobby. They have been booing Bobby. They have been laughing at Johnson. Obviously, the play worked to the audience that understand it, but the other people coming out, I couldn't get them to. They said,
Yeah.
but I have to be registered Democrat. That's where the action is. I said, well, we want to make the action.
You still feel that way? I mean, because
I don't know.
because Obama, in a certain
I
way,
don't-
could be like a
okay.
Kennedy. He's a very slick guy.
Exactly. If you asked me if Kennedy had a great sympathy that we wouldn't have for him if he wasn't killed so quickly.
Yeah.
Can you imagine if Obama had been killed
Yeah.
a year in?
Yeah, I
He
know.
would really look like a beautiful guy.
And it would have been
By the way, I have to tell you something.
Mhm. It's a
This
disturbing
is a
thought.
confession.
Yeah.
The first time I ever voted for any mainstream presidential candidate, I voted for Obama.
I think a lot of people did.
I don't know whether that's because I just got so old that I couldn't even believe the lesser evil argument. I couldn't believe my own argument
Yes.
anymore. Or whether what I really think is that I am one of those people, they say that, the vote was racist for and against him. I'm probably one of those people that really cast an entirely racial vote. The same person espousing the same causes would not have caused me to say, this time it's so important, I've got to vote for him. But I felt that the first black presidential candidate should get a nice, big, rousing vote.
Yes.
In fact, I
think
knew,
a lot of people perceive that as very important coming out of the 60s,
and I did
obviously.
it.
Yeah.
And I did it, and I confess. It may not seem to your audience a confession, but to the people that I grew up with, it's a confession. I voted for the Democratic candidate for the first time.
Was it? How much was the Vietnam War? I mean, it sounds like you were already hating the Democrats before the Vietnam War even happened. But was the Vietnam War kind of the final kind of nail in the idea of the Democrats being?
It meant a lot to a lot of other people. And don't forget, I was working in a GI coffee house, so obviously anti-war work mattered.
Obviously, GI coffee houses mean a lot to me, but my audience doesn't know particularly what they
I'm
are.
sorry.
So how did you come in contact with the GI coffee house movement?
What there was, army bases are in little small towns.
Yes.
And so we had an idea. It started, as far as I know, with Fred Gardner, someone I know. We had this idea and raised a little money, not very much, to simply rent, in our case in Tacoma, we just rented a storefront on the strip where credit jewelers and pinball parlors and so forth catered to the GIs. And we looked very much like a 60s thing. And by golly, we were filled up every night with GIs who felt very strongly that they wanted. This was drafted army. It was everybody in the country.
Yeah.
And or at least everybody who, eventually your college exemptions disappeared too. It was everybody in the country, and the place was packed with people who wanted to say, at a minimum, I'm not one of them. My hair has been cut, but that was by force.
Yeah.
And the things that the GIs were doing.
And these are kind of, to make it clear, these are, when you say 60s coffee house, it's kind of like a counterculture theme,
Well, I don't even know. I was so square. So my coffee house didn't look very counterculture. And you certainly couldn't smoke drugs inside our coffee house. I mean, we had police coming in.
I guess I just mean an orientation.
Yes, just
pictures
that
of
we
Bob
were
Dylan
different.
around.
Yes,
and stuff like that.
we had local music. There's so many great fiddlers in the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah.
We had lots and lots of local movement. I'll never forget the time that Country Joe. Remember Country Joe and
Joe
the Fish?
McDonald, yeah.
Yes, the song, the Vietnam Rag.
He's great. Yeah, that
Be
song.
the first one on your block to have a boy come home in a box.
Yeah.
Bum, bum. 1, 2, 3. What are we fighting for? Don't ask me. I don't give a damn. Next up is Vietnam. Well, he had made that song pretty famous. And
he sang it at Woodstock in '69.
Yeah, and
fabulous recording of that. Yeah,
he was having a concert in nearby Seattle.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, someone knew him who knew someone who knew him, and we called him and we said, "Would you come to the coffee house also?"
Mm-hmm.
And he said, "Sure." Well, and we put out the information around the base, and we really had very good access to that base. I mean, we had GIs in literally, we knew someone in almost every company, and we got the information out. And then
this is a story that people do not know. The contact between the left and the military during this era,
and
is
it wasn't
incredible.
us that started things, though. I mean, you couldn't walk on the base without V signs coming up. Just as long as you had long hair, and V signs coming up. The soldiers were doing things like boycotting the grapes, because the army was buying the grapes to make up for the purchases lost in the grape boycott on behalf of the farm workers.
The Cesar Chavez grape boycott.
The Cesar Chavez boycott. So the army was buying the grapes. And according to some GIs, they would ship them to Vietnam, where they would arrive rotten and go right into the harbor. And the GIs were therefore boycotting the grapes on base and throwing them around and stuff like that. They were doing so many different things.
What an amazing consciousness happening in the military at that time.
They were doing some things in Vietnam that are amazing.
Yeah.
But even on their own behalf, they were picketing these credit jewelers and other people that took advantage of GIs. They were amazing.
So how long did you stay
Believe me, this
in
was
Tacoma?
started about 2 years.
Okay.
Because I guess when I left was when one story started to sound the same as the other. I mean, these stories were so wonderful, but it was a very isolated. It was wonderful, though.
The GI coffeehouse movement only lasted a few years, but it made a really important impact. So from there,
we skipped from something. I knew there was something I was about to say. It wasn't the coffee.
I'm so sorry.
It's me. I jump around.
So what did you do after you left the coffee houses? It seems like you.
Well, I went and lived in nearby Portland. Very nice, but just living isn't enough for me. I had a little baby. It was very nice. We were together all the time. She was with me in the coffee house. And in a way, we were more together. It was like mom and dad's, being brought up in the candy store that your mother and father owned.
Yeah.
And everybody, the only problem was people would feed her too much cake.
Yeah.
But, other than that, she was, beloved. And then I moved to Portland for a couple of years of doing very little, really. And then I moved back to New York and began writing, although claiming that I wasn't really a writer, that MacBird was a product of the movement. That's how we all felt about that.
Yeah.
But believe me, it was a lot better than. Now I look around and I realize how much better my writing is than movement writing, because you can really read it. Not just get the points.
Let's get to that writing, because I mean, where were your politics when you left the coffee houses? Were you kind of thinking because it seems like that moment in late '60s, early '70s is when there was kind of a paralysis and people were thinking, where do we go?
Where I left off.
Please go ahead.
You said to me, was the war a big important thing in your organizing? And I said, well, I went to these GI coffee houses.
Yes.
But I really went to the GI coffee houses because ordinary Americans were there.
Yeah. This begins your real interest is the working class.
Right. Yes. And I thought, if we just get this damn war over, because remember that before the war, we thought we could really build a much better America.
The war's a distraction from
right,
us
and that to me
yes.
the war was a distraction.
Yes,
I know
horrific distraction. Yeah.
Right, yeah. I mean, and so
I think that point really energized the left in the 60s.
I'm not sure that everybody felt that way.
The war was blocking the Great Society from happening.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, that was Martin Luther King's big point when he finally came against the war, was that they're draining the building of the Great Society and taking all that money and using it to kill people in Vietnam.
And they were taking the energy, and they were taking the emotions, and they were taking the
language,
the organization of the movement. Mm-hmm. So to me, anti-war work was worth it for me because I was at the GI coffee houses. Mm-hmm. And after that, I mean, of course, I had sort of met the American working class, because that's who was in the army.
Yeah.
And after that, I started writing these books, one a decade, about working people.
So what was the first one?
The first one, All the Livelong Day.
Yes.
It's wonderful.
Yes.
I was so much better then. But then everybody else was better then.
Yeah.
And I was talking to people who were doing routine automated work in factories, old factories that still existed.
At a moment when that was kind of declining
Yes.
as a main
Well,
work structure.
Yes.
Yeah.
And really what I was talking to people about, not just young people, but older people, was the ways they got around these tailorized, routinized jobs.
Yes.
The thoughts in their minds that were the games they were playing to make, and not only to sabotage or slow down. Sometimes people would slow down so they could race to catch up, so they could feel like they were doing things. I mean, the fantasies people told me, and the desire to do real work that meant something. And those were the people I wrote about. And you know something? I wrote about that in All the Livelong Day with only a very small awareness that, I mean, the people there were in a situation that I was in the 60s. If you don't like this job, you quit it and move someplace else. If a band you like is playing in Minneapolis, you can move to Minneapolis even if you're married. You can always get a job that will pay the rent if you need me. Maybe you have to share something with somebody, but I mean, really, that's what life was like.
Yeah.
We knew it too.
Unemployment was very low
Yes.
even through the late
Right.
60s. Yeah.
And so we, that was the world that the GI, I mean, the first story I did for All the Livelong Day was about a strike in Lordstown, Ohio, an auto strike against, that the people were striking against the speed of the line.
Yeah, yeah.
It shocked the country because these young men had been recruited by GM because they thought that the older auto workers would object. They were setting up the fastest assembly line ever. And they thought that the older organized UAW workers would object. And they thought they could get these young people who had no union tradition and had energy, physical energy.
Yes.
Well, they got so much more than they bargained for. I mean, the older people would have been recalcitrant. The younger people stopped the line. If the line sped up from 60 cars a minute to 62 cars a minute, they would do something to every one of those 2 cars. I mean, it was amazing.
So the young people were more militant, you're saying?
Yes.
Yes.
And in fact, they had to. And so I went there when people were talking about an incredible phenomenon. The new workers, union workers, talking about not just having jobs, but, what was the word they used? Putting meaning into it. They were going to, it was a visionary word, and it'll come to me. But they were going to upgrade the jobs.
Yeah.
You'd go to these plants and people were talking about, maybe we shouldn't divide the work up this way. Maybe we should do a little bit this job and a little that job. I mean, it
seems like you're really
that was my
interested
first
in a
book.
kind of spirit aspect
Right.
to it.
That was my
Yeah.
first book with people who had that spirit.
Yeah, yeah.
And including, I must say, I'm always fair. I included some deadheads, who weren't into that spirit.
What do you mean by deadhead? Like literal Grateful Dead fans, or do you mean like?
Well, sometimes people who did. Funny that people who were too stoned, as a matter of fact, were not exactly in the vanguard of making life more meaningful. But I mean, I did a variety of people. Older people who were not sympathetic to the sexual freedom or the music of the 60s, but who also wanted to put meaning back into their work. And then book by book, these people, it was as if someone read my book and he said, we can't deal with these people who won't come in Monday and Friday, who stop the line if it's speeded up. And they began to move work offshore and basically discipline the working class.
Well, it seems like
basically discipline the 60s people who came into work.
I agree with that.
And so I wrote 4 books, and the last one, Down the Up Escalator,
is about a little bit about Occupy and the post-Occupy moment.
It's about what Down the Up Escalator, it was originally called How the 99% Live in the Great Recession. Because my publisher wanted a quick recession book.
Sure.
But I wound up writing about those 40 years that led to the recession, that put so much money in so few hands that there was no way but to essentially lend money. It's as if the ruling class said, not that I believe there is a ruling class that says one sentence, but it's if they said, I have an idea. Instead of paying these people to buy back what they produce, we'll lend them the money.
Yeah.
We'll lend them money for cars. We'll lend them money for houses that their labor cannot, or that what we pay them cannot buy back. But when will it be? How will it be paid back? somebody else will think of that.
Yeah.
So we got into a series of debt crises, the last of which was the mortgage debt
The
crisis.
housing bubble and collapsing in 2008.
I shouldn't say the last, I should say the most recent.
Most recent, yeah, you're right.
And so I wrote...
Yeah, we're definitely in another bubble, it seems like. They just keep coming.
I wrote for decades. So I wrote about the time, I wrote the Electronic Sweatshop.
The Electronic
Sweatshop was at the point that
it's a really important
computer
idea, too.
automation was going in, and everybody was saying, oh, this is going to make us all... data manipulators in the post-industrial society. Oh, yes, there may be a few troglodytes.
This is the late 80s that you wrote this. Yes.
Who can't be retrained. But rest of us are all going to be in this wonderful post-industrial
Technology
future.
will liberate us from work, in other words.
And I remember I still knew people that I met at the GI Coffee House. Down the Up Escalator begins with an interview after his death. The family of someone I met at the GI Coffee House.
Great.
Who became a very skilled worker, but still died in debt. And so I followed what was happening to people, and
not just people, but like we're the working class.
Well, the working class, but the post-industrial working class.
Yes.
Because down the Up Escalator, for instance, I'm interviewing people who are unemployed because of the recession. But that includes people who do the computer graphics for textbooks. And this guy lost his job. It's just one example. Lost his job. And I followed him for a year and a half when he was collecting unemployment insurance and blah, blah, blah. And he always said to me, no, I'm still unemployed. But gradually he was doing a little bit of this work contract.
Okay.
That's when the unemployment ran out. He was doing a little bit on contract. I said, don't you ever come across the same work from your old company? He said no. They never hired back the 20 people they fired ostensibly because of the recession, but they sent that work to India. So I'm not going to come across it. But basically, he's also not going to get that job. Neither he nor anybody younger than him is going to have that job again. So So he is a migrant worker also. He goes from place to place, or he can stay in one place because he does it on the computer. He has no benefits. He considers himself still unemployed. But in fact, that's the way he's going to be employed the rest of his life. And that's the way people as skilled as him. And he kept up with his skills. He went to school while he was unemployed.
You're telling the story of my father, honestly, because my father was an engineer for the telephone company and worked in telecommunications his whole life, and then was kind of pushed into a bad retirement plan earlier than he should have. But in either case, he had to come back and work more, and now he's doing contracting, engineering. Doesn't get benefits. He makes a lot less money, and he said to me recently, he said, I'm just stitching together a living now. It's no longer like a job at one place where I get benefits and a good salary. It's instead like every few months I have to figure out where my next job is going to come. And he asked me, is this how it is now? And I told him that's how it is for me as an adjunct teacher, is just every semester figuring out, am I going to be able to teach a few classes and where will they be? And benefits are just not even a question. I'm not going to get them, unless I'm at one school and teaching several classes at one school. So what you're saying rings very true to me, Barbara, and I think that what you're chronicling in people's lives in Down the Up Escalator and your other books is this really important notion that people's we talk about this macroeconomic stuff. You mentioned like that Thomas Piketty
This
book.
Is Piketty. This is what you want to call me?
Yeah, this is that idea of capitalism kind of in decline.
Well, it's not in decline.
Well,
we're in decline.
The people's experience of
in other
capitalism
words, you're
is in
talking
decline.
about.
And you're seeing it through people's lives. That's what I wanted to say. Yeah.
Thank you. Say it again.
Yeah. I mean, what you do, I think, and the latest book is just one example of these kind of the four books you've written. Is you write these really wonderful like kind of capsule biographies of Americans and how they're experiencing the kind of macro stuff that's being described in other books like Piketty that you just mentioned.
Yes, because what you're watching over those four books, I didn't fully grasp it in the first one, I have to say. That's why my spirit is still so happy in that one, and I was younger. But what you're having in those four,
you've grown more cynical, you would say.
Not more cynical, but I'm sad that from the 60s we went into this period where essentially, I hate to sound like an old Marxist or an old Piketty,
Please.
but you went into this period in which the capitalist class as a class was saying, we want more
Yes.
of what's produced.
Yeah.
They got more, what he calls more returns.
Mm-hmm.
They got more returns on the same kind of investments. And who do you think they took it away from? I mean,
The poorest people in the society.
the middle people.
Yeah.
That's one thing I got to say. I was well ahead of my time.
Mm.
By the time that I was writing the Electronic Sweatshop,
Yes.
I was saying, hey, you, the engineer, your father,
Yes.
this kind of computer automation is going to be applied to you, and it's not going to make you freer. It's being it's in there to count your keystrokes. It's in there to evaluate what you're done. It's
Surveil you.
It's
Yeah.
in there for surveillance. It's in there to make it possible for the job to go abroad. It's all those things, as well as the advantages that it has. I mean, we should be able to make work easier and take the product of it for ourselves.
No, I
but
absolutely
instead,
agree.
the product has been taken by the investor class.
Yes.
And some of us have been fooled to think we are the investor class because half of our pensions, which we will lose, have been invested, of course. That's the theory on which they didn't put much money aside.
Yeah.
They said, well, anyway.
Well, as someone who's chronicled the
So I feel
post-industrial moment for working people, this point has come up with my friends a few times, talking about like, well, there really isn't factory work anymore. I mean, in the United States, manufacturing isn't the primary thing that working class people do. They're working in service, right? They're working as cashiers at Walmart, and they're working in service.
I just want to make
Yeah.
a point.
Mm-hmm.
The value of American manufacturing is still very high, higher than it's ever been. There are fewer workers.
And the
And
jobs
an
the job is
effort has
worse.
been made
They're
to
paid
make them less skilled.
Yes. Uh-huh.
Instead of more skilled, which we thought we're told computer workers will be. But the value of American manufacturing is very, very, very high. It is not as if
It doesn't exist.
it's not as if a great amount of return isn't coming from that,
But
as much as is coming from McDonald's.
do you think there's possibility for
So we
real
could just
job
take it back over.
satisfaction in that
So we could just
manufacturing
take
sector?
it back over and say, okay, if this work can be done by so few people,
Yes.
let's share the work, or at least let's share the returns.
Yeah.
Instead of having the returns go into fewer and fewer hands, and those fewer and fewer hands be so desperate to invest it that they start these schemes that are going to backfire every 10 years.
Yes. Yes.
I mean, it's hard. It's sometimes hard for
and
people.
we're still on that roller coaster.
It's hard
Yes.
for people to realize, for me anyway, to realize that huge piles of money are a problem. I mean, money exerts a great pressure. If
It has a life of its own.
If it goes into a bank can't keep its money in the bank. A bank, no matter how small a return it's paying you, has to send that money out in the world someplace where they will get interest on it.
You wrote a book about sending money out to the world. I mean, didn't you write a book where you followed
Yes.
an amount of money that you
Right.
placed in a bank?
Yes, it was called
Can you
Money
tell me
Makes
a
the
little
World
bit
Goes
about
Round.
that? Yeah.
Well, that was the one book where I was interviewing people outside the United States.
Uh-huh.
And I was following my own bank account around the world. I got a book advance and I put it in a little bank.
Yeah.
And I watched what the bank did. I literally went in. There was a little bank in a small town, and it sent it overnight to Chase every night.
Right.
And you'll learn a little about Fed funds. Most of the interviewing was abroad, which I might say I missed something by not working in my own language. I'm good at dialogue. I love the dialogue.
Yeah, it seems like when we were speaking earlier, and you were writing down something that I was saying. You were very careful about say what you said before.
Right,
Don't
suddenly,
try and flower it together.
No, you weren't flowering it. You were making it clearer.
You want natural language.
Right.
You want the first thought, best thought. Almost.
I think when you read, people said to me, when I went to Astoria, Oregon.
Yes.
As part of all the Livelong.
Oh, I love Astoria, Oregon. That's a fantastic little town.
Well, then it was the Bumblebee tuna fish plant. And all the workers were Finnish, or a great many were Finnish.
Why was that?
Well, they just had settled there from Finland. They were red Finns, a lot of them. People who had actually gone back to the Finnish Soviet Republic
fascinating
and
history.
came back.
Yeah.
And I was interviewing young people and old people, and I didn't want to use real names. So I had to go to another town, take the names out of a yearbook of another Finnish town that was in another part of the United States. And one of the things I had to try to do, because I believe I really catch speech patterns, and young people speak a little differently than old people, and Finns speak a little differently than other people, even though they don't have accents. And I had to get the right names for the right ages. I mean, people could tell that my Workulas and Kukulas, they could tell whether the name was right for someone of that age, because people get, so I really think I get whole people. I pride myself on it. And
you bring a flavor to it. You know what I mean?
I don't feel I got
something
quite that in the foreign.
Yeah.
I was working through translation.
Well, beyond that, what about the economic stuff that you found out in that book?
Yeah, it was true. I predicted the crash that came. I saw that there was more and more money piling up, and I was trying to trace my money into real growth.
Yes.
Whether environmentally growth is good or bad, and very little was going on. All my money was going into these schemes for circulating money. At that time...
Money making money.
Yes, at that time, the big thing was mergers and acquisitions.
What year is this?
This was the mid-'90s.
Okay, yeah.
So everybody was merging and acquisitioning.
So you're moving towards the dot-com crash is the one that you're talking about, yes.
And you see the same money turning over and over, but no new production based on it.
It seems like that's happening now.
It's continued.
Yeah.
So you knew, or I think I said rather subtly, you knew that this couldn't go on forever.
Yes.
And that in capitalism, by the way, it can go on forever in socialism. That is to say, if investment isn't the problem, if the problem isn't how to make more money on invested money, then you can have a stagnant economy. And we may have to have a stagnant economy.
Yeah.
I mean, we can change production from some things to others, but we may not have to be able to produce more. But under capitalism, that's a crisis. That's a crash.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's the environmental situation, along with in consumerism, all this stuff that's being produced. Do you ever think about that element of it? The kind of I do. Nonstop production seems unsustainable from many different perspectives, environmental and otherwise.
It's funny that you should say that. If you knew how old I am, I don't know what your readers must think now that I've said this, but I can remember when McDonald's was new, and the hamburgers were 15 cents,
right,
and the sign said 6 million sold, 8 million sold, 30 million sold, no billions, 250 million sold. And I said, this can't go on forever.
It's a lot of burgers.
Because there's an infinite amount of beef.
Yes.
And if there isn't an amount of beef, even if we can change grass to beef, even if we can turn sand to beef, the world is not infinite, it's finite.
Yes.
This can't go on forever. And I used to think that, and that's what I used to think when it was saying 30 million.
Yeah.
150 million. Those were the numbers. Now what are they? I don't think they put those numbers up anymore.
I don't think they do anymore, but it's mind-boggling to think about. and I think that point is something that, people in the 60s, I know it's kind of a broad brush to say people in the 60s, but activists in the left in the 60s, it seemed like they were beginning to be, there was a moment of being aware a little bit of what industrial America was and kind of and understanding.
It was the beginning of an environmental movement, and the environmental parts of it didn't die. They were quickly reemerged when their environmentalism, their niceness environmentalism, was tied in with the danger to the planet.
Yeah.
But that niceness, that environmental niceness, let's be nice. Let's save the other animals because it's nice. That persisted. The Sierra Club and all that kind of stuff. Unions. I know.
People are acting now because it's not about niceness. It's about
right. It's got to save
stuff.
the world.
Yes. Yeah.
But it's throwback from the 60s. I don't think you realize, for instance, that the steel workers have long been allied with the Sierra Club and were very important. This union was very important in getting American steel plants to be, to the degree that they are, modernized and give off less
it's interesting.
particles.
You don't generally think of the steelworkers unions and the
Right.
Sierra Club as being in the same room together.
They've been together, and that's a product of the 60s.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
literally of people that I know that went through that.
Mm-hmm.
Because there was a point when I remember there was one dramatic moment when the steel owners were fighting a requirement that they give off less particles in their smokestack.
Yeah.
That they turn their smokestack from black to light
Right.
gray.
Light gray.
Right. And they had rented buses under the assumption that they were going to bring all the steel workers to Washington to protest for their jobs. And it was a complete shock to them that the steel workers union said, we're not going on this. If you don't modernize these plants, there's going to be an end to American steel.
And that's amazing because the right wing has pitched the union.
I'm not going to say this was typical,
Yeah,
but I am going to say that 60s people I knew worked in the steel workers when that happened. And by the way, it did save steel jobs.
The right wing pitches environmentalism and environmental regulations as hurting workers. When here you have an example that you're telling me, as someone who actually knows the workers, that the workers are actually pushing for environmental regulations in some cases.
In this one union,
yeah, it's a fascinating example, though.
They recognize basically to not modernize was also to have old, decrepit steel plants. They said you're not going to have steel very much longer in the United States.
Yeah.
If after all, they're not building old plants in Korea. They're not building old plants in China
as well, I'm sure.
They're not building old plants other places.
Yeah.
You have to modernize
Yeah.
if we're going to keep our jobs. Now, that's first of all not always true, and it's second of all there's not always people in the union to realize that, and in the short term,
Yeah.
So I'm not saying that there's any miracle solution, but that was a product of the 60s. That particular alliance.
It's such an important legacy. I mean, when you think about...
And it came from the time before we feared the end of the world through global warming, through climate change. It was a time when we simply feared how unhealthy we would all become because of the pollution.
And I mean, it's part of it, and a wider examination. I think people on the left in the 60s were looking at the impact of everything on the whole American way of life on not just the environment, but on black people and people in Vietnam and working class and all the different elements of how this machine, to put it in Savio's words, how this machine was kind of impacting everybody's lives. Do you see, since you're someone that seems like you were pretty politically savvy early on, I mean, MacBird was already attacking Kennedy, and the Democratic Party as being hopeless in terms of getting the change they want.
It's funny, we mentioned Obama and how I voted for him anyway.
That's what I wanted to ask you about electoral politics.
I understood when I saw Obama, remember that Obama's campaign happened right in the middle of the recession had hit.
Yes.
The Great Recession had hit. McCain obviously didn't understand anything about it, but called for a moratorium. We should stop campaigning and go back to Washington and do something, but he didn't know what.
It was a gimmick. Campaign
that
gimmick.
was a gimmick.
Yeah.
Well, another campaign gimmick was that Obama stood there publicly with Robert Rubin and, the former former head of Harvard, Larry Summers.
Lawrence Summers.
Obama appeared with Robert Rubin and Lawrence Summers, saying, "We're the grown-ups. Don't worry, we will handle this."
Yeah.
Not saying we're Roosevelt, but we're the grown-ups. There are ways to handle this. I'm not saying what they are. Well, I knew then that he would be as he was on economics. Well, I didn't know he would be as bad because those grown-ups actually favor a little more Keynesianism.
Yeah. It's like a little more. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
They don't favor, but they favor keeping it going. They do favor, Summers does favor having a certain amount of, pure Keynesian.
They're liberals,
No, they're not liberals.
No? How would you describe them?
No, that's what I say. When I saw him with them, those are the people who did the NAFTA. They're bankers.
Yes.
They favor the interests of banks. They just recognize that once in a while you have to put a little money back into it. But when I saw him with them, I knew he wasn't going to be very good on economics.
Yeah.
Because they were the people who had, done the deregulation, who had done the, Robert Rubin and
the bailout.
Summers.
Yeah.
No, the bailout, remember, hadn't happened yet.
Well,
They
I'm
were
talking about
both
the
talking
original
about
bailout, the Bush bailout.
The Bush
yeah,
bailout.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't, but I saw, so I voted for Obama anyway, knowing that he was going to be a middle Democrat. He was not going to be a neo-Roosevelt. At this point, we can say maybe he didn't have a chance to, but I think he really didn't really understand that stuff very quickly. It takes a long time to get it.
And you're more aligned with the Clinton version of the Democrats.
He was the Clinton.
Yeah.
Yes, the deregulation and in other words, give us 20 more years.
Do you think you'll make the same vote for Hillary based on her being a woman? You know what I mean?
I don't know.
You don't have to.
I don't know. I keep wondering if she would have been at least tougher on what she had decided to do.
Because there is a lot of thought about
whatever limited calculation she might have made on pump priming and so forth. Maybe she would have been able to. I don't know.
Yeah.
That's a good question.
Yeah. Well, it seems like that 60s identity politics stuff, about like women and black people and stuff was really important part of where, that where the communities that you come from. And so it's understandable.
No, it isn't.
Well, I mean,
I was horrified when my daughter went to college and it was organized on identity politics.
Well, in fact, that's what I mean by the controversy about it.
That was so sad. So sad.
Can you what are you talking about with your daughter?
Well, she went to Barnard, and people were after them to be in the Jewish club, to be in the black club. How could you be? And she formed a group that was something called New Cultural Encounters that had a lot of different groups in it. Yeah. I remember they had a show, had a thing, Our Roots and Tubers, which was people's cooking from all different places.
Oh, that's great, yeah.
But I felt terrible that that's what should be left of the 60s was the idea
For
that
you, it was class? Is class the more important element, or?
People!
Yeah.
Even the ruling class I'm not against as a class. I cannot believe I can't believe how excited people are about the idea of putting some of those bankers in jail.
Yeah.
I think it's important that there should have been consequences, financial consequences.
Yeah.
Because they're just going to do the same thing again. Maybe jail is a financial consequence.
Yeah.
Maybe jail is a consequence that would have a...
Some people want the guillotine for the bankers, so...
But I couldn't believe the interest in them personally. You have to understand, when you've got this much money, when money has collected in fewer and fewer hands, and you allow capitalism, you allow private banking, you allow brokerage houses...
Yeah.
They have to do something with the money.
Yes.
And if they can't do anything real with it, they're going to do something fake with it. They have to do it.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter who they are. Deregulation would have prevented the particular scheme. Fighting deregulation.
Yeah.
Deregulation made the particular schemes possible that blew up in our faces.
Sure.
But they have to do something with the money. I almost can't. Down the Up Escalator, I have a couple of nice bankers. Of course, they happen to be unemployed. But
Yeah. Well, it seems like chronicling that arc.
I just don't know that top. Yeah. Maybe that top. Those people really are horrible because I remember one thing: the weathermen in the '60s were actually, for the most part, children of the real ruling class.
Yeah.
The rest of us were what college students were then. Children of upper working class, because college was free, children of accountants and doctors and, that's who we were. Engineers, the weathermen, that slim slice of people who blew things up and did things like that. It contained a very high percent of people whose fathers were in fact presidents and vice presidents of the telephone company.
I think you mentioned that to me about what people hanging out at the coffee house that were kind of terrorist types.
Right, and that was very odd.
They were from the ruling class.
But sometimes I wonder whether
children of the ruling class,
whether their view of the ruling class didn't include something that ours didn't. They were close up, and they seemed to think of them as ruthless and terrible.
Yeah.
We thought of it as just, well, you've got to get the money away from them. You've got to change
Systemic.
the system. Yes.
Yes.
Right. Maybe they knew something we didn't. Maybe to be up in those positions, you really do have to be ruthless and personally disgusting.
Right.
Anyway, they had some traits of their parents, you got to say, but they thought their parents
really
were
interesting
awful,
stuff.
unbelievable. They thought their parents were unbelievable. So maybe they do know something about the ruling class than I did, but that I didn't.
Mm-hmm. So it seems like your kind of take on things has been focused on the structures of capitalism in a sense, and then kind of it's interesting for me to think about what your work has been about, because it's both kind of looking at that macro stuff, but about like capitalism and how the logic of capitalism doesn't really work, but then
it works.
Well, it works for them, yes, but it doesn't work for the rest of us. And then you really kind of
chronicle
that.
It's been around causing great pain for a very long time.
Yeah, and
causing great production. We can't afford the great production anymore.
Yeah.
So now that there's nothing left but great pain, it is time to get rid of capitalism.
No, I absolutely agree, and I think that's a good note to end on. It's time to get rid of capitalism. Barbara Garson, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Your newest book is called Down the Up Escalator, and I'll have it featured on the blog and have some links to where you can find this book. It's a fantastic chronicle of life in 21st century America. Thanks so much for talking to me.
Thank you.